So you've all heard me talk about why I think we need to do removals. It's time to hear from the people who really matter. And Carrie, we're going to start it off with you. British Airways has incorporated removals into their net zero plans. You've been one of the forefront leaders in terms of investing in carbon removals. Can you talk a little bit about, why is this a necessary component of your net zero plan, complementing your investments in efficiency and sustainable aviation fuel?
Sure. Is this on?
I'm getting you.
Good. Hi, everyone, and thank you, Anna, for that. So I think, in a nutshell, so you set it out there in your opening talk there, the pathway to net zero for aviation by 2050 is not doable without carbon removals. Whether it's IATA, whether it's our own roadmap, whether it's the UN, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Committee for Climate Change in the UK, all of these roadmaps agree aviation cannot reach net zero by 2050 without carbon removals. So it's essential for us. And I think if we look at our motivation for doing it, it's really kind of two main elements. First one is thinking about that long-term need to scale this market. And you set out that according to the IATA roadmap, aviation will need a minimum of 500 million tonnes of carbon removals per year. I say minimum because that requires a favourable wind on all the other elements. So it's highly possible, if not probable, that it could be significantly more than that. And as you also said, if we don't start working on this now, there is no way we will have that scale of infrastructure, of the ability to do that by 2050. So it's critical from that perspective that we get into action as soon as possible. The second rationale for our engagement in this is a kind of short-term, immediate need. The climate emergency is here and now, and we have carbon removal. So you've spoken here about direct air capture, but there's multiple different types of carbon removals, and many of them are available here and now. If we can start taking carbon out of the atmosphere immediately, we can prevent the higher increases in temperature and volatile climate systems that we're seeing. So the sooner we do it, the better for everyone. And those are really the main drivers for us in terms of why we're acting early and keen to try and scale this market and stimulate the market.
Fabulous, and thank you for that. Oh my goodness, you're loud when you talk into your own. Anyway, Myles, can you set the stage for us and provide a little more context around the Oxford Principles? And when we talk about permanent, when we talk about durable, what do we actually mean, and why is that important?
Well, the first permanence we need to think about is actually the opposite of the removal permanence, and that's what you mentioned in your talk, the fact that when we burn a fossil fuel, the impact of the CO2 generated by that fossil fuel it lasts for hundreds of thousands of years. It continues to affect the climate indefinitely, and therefore the only genuine compensation for generating CO2 from burning a fossil fuel is disposing of CO2 permanently on a similar timescale. So that sets that sort of multi-millennial timescale that we need to think about for disposing of CO2. And the other thing which I would the reason every one of us who benefits from the continued use of fossil fuels today, and we all do, I work for a global university. We have no intention of stopping being a global university, and therefore we're going to depend on airlines to enable us to be a global university for the next many decades, we hope, many centuries even more so. So, we've set ourselves in Oxford a target of net zero by 2035, and part of the background to those Oxford Principles for net zero aligned offsetting was a realization that we're not going to get to net zero by 2035 just by doing our best to reduce the emissions of our own estate. If we want to remain a global university, we're going to depend on the continued use of fossil fuels, particularly in international travel. And if we are going to do that, we've got a responsibility to scale permanent CO2 disposal. And that's where I think the case for high carbon sectors like the aviation industry, for investing in permanent carbon dioxide removal goes beyond what you think you're going to need for your sector in 2050. There's also a moral case that if you're benefiting specifically from continued use in fossil fuels, we know the world is going to generate too much CO2. That's a certainty now. We're not going to stop using fossil fuels in time to actually meet our climate goals. One of the things I spent a lot of the last COP talking to people, sometimes arguing with people, about the phrase fossil phase out. And a point I like to keep reminding people is we've left it too late to meet our climate goals by phasing out fossil fuels. One day we will stop using fossil fuels, unquestionably, but we have to stop fossil fuels from causing global warming before the world stops using fossil fuels. We've left it too late to do it by just stopping using fossil fuels entirely. And that's why that any sector that benefits from continued use of fossil fuels has a moral obligation to scale up permanent carbon dioxide disposal, because that's the only way of stopping continued fossil fuel use from causing global warming in the longer term.
Wonderful. And in that scale up, we need to get moving. And, Hemant, the IATA net zero roadmaps that say we need 500 million tons per year by 2050, what can you speak a little bit to what themes you're seeing in terms of, having carbon dioxide removal in net zero plans? Are you seeing, we've got leadership from leaders like BA. What are you seeing in terms of the global aviation industry and the recognition of that need for removals to complement all of those other efforts?
Yeah, hi everyone. So, when we did the roadmaps, we were really trying to understand what could be achievable in a practical sense based on what we know is going to be coming in terms of maturity in the coming future. And just to re-emphasize what has already been said, even though we looked at all of the levers which we're all quite familiar with, there is still going to be a significant amount in terms of removals that is required. That's required across all different roadmaps. I see some other institutions in the audience who have also developed their own roadmaps, and I think they all agree. So this is a solution we all need. Now, what we find is that when I talk to the airlines, when my team talks to the airlines, we do see a growing recognition of removals and the need to move now, because we need to start to invest in this space so we can support the scale-up. And as IATA, as we represent over 330 member airlines from across the world, and part of our role is to try and support that. Education across the airlines, providing the right tools in terms of procurement, etc. And we've been asked to actually support on that basis, and we're working across this industry segment, working with industry, working across airlines, so we can try to develop these best practices so that we can support the different actors to actually help support scale-up. But of course, scale-up also depends on governments playing a part as well. There's a role in terms of incentives and so on as well, so maybe we can cover that a little bit as well. But I think the recognition across the airlines is growing pretty quickly, and I think that's a really good thing.
Well, and that's the perfect segue to what I wanted to ask Gabrielle, which is, how do we get everybody to get off their butts and start investing now? How do we make this happen today instead of 10 years from now?
That is the many, many $1 question, probably $1 trillion question that actually keeps me awake at night and that I'm actually thinking of 24/7. So thank you very much for putting that question to me. So I'm co-founder of Curate and Rethinking Removals, two organizations that are dedicated to scaling carbon removals at the pace that we actually need to. And at Curate, we actually provide portfolio solutions for businesses, but also deeply understanding the ecosystem to find out what it will take to get people to buy now. Why should they do that? So we have a lot of conversations with business leaders, and we're working quite closely with British Airways and who are showing fantastic leadership in this space. But the main thing that I hear from business leaders about acting now is, if I take this to my CFO and say I need a budget for carbon removals, then I get question number 1, is anyone telling us to do this? Question 2, what's anyone else doing? And question 3, what can we claim? What credit can we get for doing this? And so those are the 3 crucial questions that any CFO sort of needs to answer. And I'm fascinated by what's happening in the aviation space, because this is a sector where the coming compliance is coming faster than I think in any other area. But also the thing that Myles was talking about, this is actually the business model depends and will depend for a while on using fossil fuels. And so there's a moral obligation maybe, but there's also a business imperative because here are some useful things that might be interesting for any of you to hear, which are, first of all, we've been operating at Curate for 2 years, and in that time, prices of carbon removal supply have gone up by 40%. And we've actually done some analysis now, which is making it look as if it could be another 50% increase between now and 2035. And that sounds a bit surprising, because at the moment, there's a dearth of buyers. It feels like it's a demand-constrained market, but it's not demand-constrained. It's demand-suppressed. Because at the moment, people aren't quite acting, they don't quite understand, they don't know that they need to do it. And as the recommendations from the Oxford Offsetting Principles, from IATA, as this gets integrated in CORSIA, as the compliance comes along, there's going to be a supply crunch and prices are going to go up. And it's not just that prices are going to go up, it's access to supply is going to be challenging. So a lot of the suppliers that we work with, they're so eager to get off-takes now. So there's 3 different ways that you can do it. First of all, you can do an off-take where you pay up front for it. And then, you've guaranteed your supply at a certain price. Or you can do an off-take where you say, I promise to buy it, and this is a signal to the market that there's going to be a future market, so we can then finance it. And Curate did a piece of work with British Airways at the end of last year, which was actually the world's first of a kind financing for taking an off-take for removals and turning it into financing for people on the ground. So you can pay up front, you can just commit, but have a different mechanism for financing. And the other thing is, if you buy now, you can also negotiate a first refusal for future credits from any of these suppliers. And I think when we're talking to CFOs about this, smart CFOs are realizing this is going to be needed, prices are going up, supply is going to be constrained, and also we can tell a good story. This is the point. I loved our conversations, Hemant, with IATA, because it's the first time I'd heard any sector recognizing that it's existential to us to grow this industry. And therefore, we need to be playing our part because we're going to have it. So I think those are some of the reasons. It's basically get in now so that you can get the best prices, you can get the best access, you can get the best story, and you can show that you're showing the leadership and commitment to building the industry that's going to be so essential for the aviation sector.
And when you're looking at that, Carrie, I'm sure one of the things that comes up as well is, how is the public going to react? How are my customers going to react when I invest in something like this? How important are things like the Oxford Principles, or like having the entire industry association say this is going to be necessary? How does that figure into that public sentiment of this is something that we need to do?
We actually moved ahead of IATA having their position on this, and ahead of the latest Oxford Offsetting Principles, but even the first set of them were extremely helpful for us in terms of making the case for why we need this in future. Interestingly, from a customer perspective, so we first introduced carbon removals to our customers on our consumer-facing platform called Collaborate. So we had some emissions offsets, we introduced sustainable aviation fuel as an option, and then I think we were the first airline to offer certified carbon removals credits as well, available for customers to purchase. When we did that, the initial uptake of them wasn't strong, but we thought it was really important that we had it on there to start building awareness about what these are. And we did some customer kind of consumer research. And while a lot of people had heard about offsets, some of them had heard about SAF. They thought it sounded cool, but they didn't really know what it was. And almost no one had heard about carbon removals. But once we explained it to them, they were like, wow, that makes sense. Why don't we do more of this? So, it's still there on our platform. We still offer it as a blend with sustainable aviation fuel and carbon removals. We need to start educating people about what these are, the opportunities, the climate opportunity, the business and the jobs opportunity, especially within the UK, because it's super exciting. It's not just a great climate solution, it's an economic opportunity as well. And in the UK, we're uniquely positioned to really capitalise on that and make the most of it for our kind of UK economy as well.
Mm-hmm. Gabrielle.
Just a couple of quick comments. One of them is that, the point about how people react to this. I think there are fabulous stories to tell. The incredibly exciting ecosystem of new developments. I was there when Stratos was just with the groundbreaking. It was just desert all around, and in just barely over a year, you can see how it's developing now. But all of the others as well is a very exciting ecosystem. But also people say, I didn't know you could do this. And it's not just stopping the problem getting worse, it's actually fixing it. It's actually cleaning up our mess. It's something that I think is a fabulous story. And there's one other thing I wanted to mention related to how you tell this story, which is based on what you just said, Carrie, which is about the government, the UK government, any government, but particularly the UK government now. Acting now is actually showing the government a level of commitment as they're thinking about how they're going to do their compliance. And the government is being driven increasingly by what people in the street are saying. So how customers react and how the government reacts and being a first mover all become quite tightly connected together to this story of we're building this and this is going to be a solution that will actually solve the problem.
Myles.
And you both, Hemant and Gabrielle both mentioned the importance of government in this. And one message, I don't know if there's anybody from UK government here, but one really important message to remind people of is if we look in the scenarios in which carbon prices, which is sort of a proxy for stringency of climate policy or unpopularity of current government, you could also say, or unpopularity of climate policy in these scenarios. The scenarios in which carbon prices go through the roof as we approach net zero are the ones where we are supply constrained on carbon removal. And that's a really important fundamental problem. If you don't have a way of getting rid of carbon dioxide as you're approaching net zero, your only opportunity left is to actually ban the activities that generate the carbon dioxide in the first place. And that's the point at which climate policy becomes incredibly expensive and almost certainly incredibly unpopular. So this is the message we need to be getting across to the world's governments, is your choice is investing in carbon removal today so that you have it available so that we don't have to ban the activities that generate fossil origin carbon dioxide in the future, or face the prospect of that horrendous unpopularity which would come from telling people, no, you can't take a holiday by air because we haven't invested enough in carbon removal, so there's nothing to do with the CO2 you're going to generate. And that's where I think you'll get politicians to focus minds, because they'll realize that this is the risk they don't want to run. And this is something I think we do need to get across to our current generation of politicians, particularly working in environmental departments, are still thinking in a slightly, I wouldn't want to name names, of course, in any current or previous administration, but there's still a tendency to think in a sort of pre-2009 mentality that we can do this by just reducing the amount of carbon dioxide we generate. We can't. It's too late for that. We're going to have to get rid of a colossal quantity of CO2 over the course of this century, and we need, therefore, to be scaling the technology to be doing that now.
Yeah.
And I think, you mentioned the prospect of banning activities. Well, the reality is more than half of the world hasn't been on an airplane. And how is it, incumbent upon, how would that come across if the developed world were to say, hey, people who've never been on an airplane before, you can't. And airlines don't just move people. Airlines connect people. They form the basis for that global economy, that interconnected economy that we have.
We've had this pointed out in no uncertain terms to me as a university. We can introduce sort of policies to minimize flying, and we do try to reduce the amount of flying we require our students and staff to do. But then, I talk to colleagues in Australian universities or in Japanese universities or South American universities. They say, look, if we want to engage with global academia, we've got no option but to get on a plane. And that's fair enough. And so I think exactly, turning round, particularly sitting in a highly privileged country like the UK, which has built its prosperity on using fossil fuels, let's face it, we were the ones who kicked this off, after all, in the first place, and saying to the rest of the world, no, we want you to keep it in the ground without offering any alternative, is just morally unacceptable.
And Hemant.
Yeah, but just to build on what's already been said, we are, of course, pushing very hard for technology maturity, technology scale-up as well. But another reason for doing this is also that we need functioning markets. So we need to move away from relying or catching up or responding to policy measures. We need to actually get to a functioning market, as we need to do for SAF, by the way, as well. And so once we get to that level and we have a competitive market for some of these solutions, then we as airlines can move forward as we would do in any other business principle. That's where we need to move forward too.
And with those competitive markets, those need to really go hand in hand. And so how do you see that interplay between markets and compliance markets like Corsia? We're also seeing, California and British Columbia have added direct air capture to sequestration into their low carbon fuel standards as a way of incentivizing that early investment. How do you see those two things going hand in hand?
Well, I think they're complementary, really, in a way. First of all, you have the compliance markets, and there's going to be an obligatory part as to how different levers might support those solutions. But also, airlines have broader obligations as well. So, and I think that competitive market for the sourcing of these products is what's necessary to comply, but also meet voluntary obligations as well.
Perfect. And I think I saw Carrie and then Gabrielle.
Yeah, so I was actually going to come in exactly to your question. So the compliance market is absolutely crucial. And I'd say in aviation, we're lucky that the foundation that's been put in place by Corsia. Now, Corsia is not perfect. It does still need to be strengthened. But we already have an incredible mechanism by which we can bring carbon dioxide removals into a global compliance market for aviation. So it's a huge opportunity. We're already thinking about that compliance obligation and how we can introduce removals as part of that. And we're working actively with IATA to try and influence ICAO to adopt that in the next iteration of Corsia. So super important. We're also seeing really strong signals from UK government in terms of the SAF mandate legislation now offering incentives for removals, which is very, very welcome. And we'd like to see that go a step further so that the emissions trading system also incentivizes funding of early action on carbon removals, so we get the credits for that now. Because to Gabrielle's point, trying to make the case for this to your kind of CFOs will be a whole lot easier if we can do that. And so I think we need hand in hand to work with government and the project developers to help mobilise that.
Can I just ask, we have a SAF mandate and incentives for removals. Should we not have a mandate for removals?
That's what I was about to say.
I was going to say, or we could just combine the two.
So a point here really.
Sorry to put you on the spot.
I think a point here about the relationship between the compliance and voluntary markets is that it's very clear that the voluntary markets need to be functioning for compliance to come. Governments need to have the assurance that supply is going to be there. They need to have the assurance that the markets are working, and I think that's a relationship between them. But I was going to say exactly that, Myles, which is that one of the wonderful things about working with the aviation industry is you've already been doing this for SAF. We've already been really working to get a functioning market. We've already got governments who are giving mandates which are actually meaningful, robust targets, but actually achievable, so that that's something at a level playing field. That's something that businesses understand. And how wonderful it would be if those experiences in making the market for SAF and those experiences of getting the SAF mandates could actually rhyme with what happens in removals. And I think governments are going to notice that. So what can we do to make it happen?
Carrie, then Hemant.
Yes, I think the UK government has already signalled that their previous government, hopefully this one too, contracts for difference for carbon dioxide removals, for engineered removals, is in the plan already. We'd like to see that extended to beyond engineered removals so we scale up, so we can get more volume out of the atmosphere in the short term while we scale up that longer term solution as well. So I think there's opportunities for that. And so interestingly, it's almost the reverse of the SAF story, where we've got a commitment to contracts for difference before we've got the mandate. With SAF, we kind of had a commitment to a mandate, and then just last week heard about the revenue certainty mechanism. But you're right, there's very strong parallels between the two processes. We do need government policy, and whichever way it comes, we need it.
Absolutely. Hemant.
Yeah, and maybe just to add, I think, with our experience on SAF, I wouldn't say we have a functioning market right now. There's still a lot more work to be done, and also, we also need to be careful that mandates by themselves don't create a functioning market. At least from the source, if you're looking at a procurement perspective from an airline, the mandate doesn't actually create that functioning market itself. So I think there's a lot more lessons that we are learning from SAF, which we definitely need to bring into the carbon removal space as well.
One thing that a mandate, or the promise of a mandate, does do is it gives you an answer to that question number one from the CFO. Is anybody telling us to do it? So one of the marvelous things that the Oxford Offsetting Principles update did this year, thank you very much, Myles and all your colleagues, is for the first time ever for any voluntary rule setter, it said you need to start buying carbon removals now. It was the first of any of the voluntary rule setters to make that absolutely clear. So the first one to say, yes, someone's telling us to do it. But if even the promise of a mandate is another piece of evidence that goes to the CFO to say, this is coming, it's going to cost you, get the pricing and the supply in now.
So we know, and we know from the Oxford Principles, from leading academics, in our end state, in net zero, we need every single remaining emission to be counterbalanced by essentially a negative emission with equivalent storage, and we need that 1 plus -1 to equal 0. We also know that you can't go straight to that end state today. We can't go to a world where we're using 100% SAF and 100% permanent carbon removals. There's going to be a scale up. There's going to be portfolio approaches that we need to start with. And we also know that there's an incredible amount of scrutiny around the aviation sector right now in light of some of the news about offsets that might not be delivering what we had originally thought they were going to. So both from a customer perspective when you're looking at potential purchasing options, and then more from the overall infrastructure and regulatory perspective, how do we ensure credibility? How do we ensure that when we do this, that the right guardrails are in place to know that when you say you've bought a ton of carbon removal, that a ton of carbon has actually come out of the air and gone somewhere and stayed there? And how do we work to scale that up, and how do we make sure that we're maintaining the public trust and the government trust as we do that? I'm just arbitrarily going to start and go from my left to right. So Myles, Carrie, Gabrielle, Hemant.
Well, I think that was really a question for you, Carrie, but I'm happy to chip in with a view on this, which is that, first of all, you mentioned the need for both nature-based removals and permanent engineered removals now in order to get the volume of taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. We absolutely get that, and we really emphasize that point in the Oxford Principles. But it's also very important to recognize the long-term limits to the biosphere in terms of how much carbon we can expect to put away into the biosphere to compensate for any continued use of fossil fuels. And, us academics are arguing about when the party's going to end on that one, but it will end relatively soon. I mean, within decades for sure. So anybody who's planning on still using fossil fuels past mid-century needs to have a plan for 100% engineered removals by that time to compensate for any continued use of fossil fuels that they're making at that point. And so I think it's much more about, on this credibility issue, it's much more about having a demonstrable plan than it is exactly what you're doing today. And you need to be putting investment behind the plan. I mean, it's all very well saying, don't worry, in 2049 we'll switch to 100% engineered removals, but we'll just do whatever up until then. That's not going to work. That's rightly shouldn't convince your shareholders, and it certainly shouldn't convince your other stakeholders either. So it's having what would be great would be if purchasers of removals would actually publish the profile they plan to follow. That would send a really positive market signal, and we can actually show you in the scenarios what has to happen to the fraction of your removals that's permanently being stored back underground. It's around 10% by the early 2030s, 50% by 2040, 100% by 2050. If you can show us you're following that pathway, then I think we have an answer to the skeptics who are saying this is just sort of shuffling carbon around and not really addressing the problem.
So if you want to look in the IAG annual report for 2023, you can see our roadmap with carbon removals set out in that and how we get to that. And exactly as you say, by 2050, our intention is that all of our residual emissions will be addressed by removals, not through avoided emissions credits. I think back to your original question, Anna, the credibility of this and what to do with the kind of nature-based element, I think it's worth just recognising that we have a climate crisis, but we have a nature and biodiversity crisis as well, and they're running in parallel. And the opportunity with removals is to fix, or at least address, both of those. So there is some scepticism around avoided emissions offsets and nature-based removals offsets. We should not stop doing it because of that. We need to fix it. We need to make it more credible. We need very robust monitoring and accounting systems, reporting. All of those are coming. Some of them are in place. We need those to be more rigorous. We need to build strength in that and keep going with those investments, because stopping that is also not the right way to go forward. We need to build that market too, to respect nature and invest in nature. In terms of our customers and how we're assuring credibility, is really kind of looking to working with trusted partners like Curate, who help us kind of double down on the due diligence, checking with the projects that we're purchasing, giving us that extra level of assurance on the monitoring and verification that goes with those credits. And it's making sure that the international compliance standards are kind of coming in and addressing all the different types of removals that exist. So all of those in combination, I think, really important.
So yes, I was going to say we put as soon as we founded Curate, we put a lot of effort into the due diligence, of course, and so it's really we look at every aspect of the suppliers that we work with, not just does the science work, not just are they actually going to be able to deliver what they say, but also what's the risk of non-delivery, but also are they likely still to be in business? What's their financial status? And particularly, we have a whole big effort around beyond carbon. So it's not just something that's on the side. We think that suppliers that go beyond just carbon are likely to continue to be sustainable in the future. And so that's another big criterion when it comes to the DD. So doing the due diligence is important, but it's kind of table stakes, right? And there's plenty of organizations out there, the ICVCM in particular, is charged with trying to make sure that carbon credits have the integrity that we need in the future, and they're doing a good job of that with their core carbon principles. But I think beyond that, it's not actually true. It's not. People have a fear that if it's a kind of nature-based, then it's a bit more dodgy, and if it's tech, it's not. As you mentioned, direct air capture really is a kind of platinum standard for this, because you can't get the CO2. You can sort of put it in a blimp. You can measure it. You can weigh it. You know exactly what you've got. But other carbon removals methods, it's harder to do that measuring and monitoring and verification. And others, everything's got something that makes it challenging, and we're going to need this portfolio combination. So regular listeners and readers will know that I am utterly allergic to nature or tech. Which one is it? Because there's actually an entire spectrum of different combinations of natural resources and human ingenuity that go to making this area. And every single one of them is needing its own direct due diligence, its own methodology, its own protocols, its own attention. And I think one of the ways that we can catch the bullets is by that intense due diligence. And one of the ways is from getting away from the idea that this is a kind of sneaky way to wash away our climate sins, and more into the thing that we've been talking about, which is we're building a new sector from scratch. And some of those are going to go wrong and some of those are not. And we can do our best to make sure that they don't go wrong, and when they do go wrong, we can fix it. In our portfolios, we just guarantee that if something does go wrong, we'll swap it out for something else. But broadly speaking, this is about building a new sector from scratch, and not about just making ourselves not feel guilty anymore. And I think with that kind of mentality, you can get away from of course they have to have high integrity, but it's not about whether there's an article on the front page of The Guardian about whether you did the wrong thing. It's about collectively building a new sector and getting it to the place where we all need it to be.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I totally agree with that. We need to move forward, and sometimes, we might find that some of the things we've looked at have not been as optimum as we wanted. So we have to, to actually address that, we need that accounting mechanism, robust, transparent accounting mechanisms. We need to make sure that there's reciprocity across governments as well. And we can focus on compliance frameworks, global compliance frameworks, which are very important. But we need first movers as well. I mean, the work British Airways have done is really important, moving forward with this. And also, something we haven't quite mentioned is we need to build the awareness across passengers of what we're trying to do as an industry. So that awareness has to come part and parcel of all the scale-up we're trying to do.
Absolutely, that piece that an airline's Scope 1 emissions are actually their customers' Scope 3 emissions, and that if an airline can reduce its Scope 1, either through use of SAF or increased efficiency or using removals against a Scope 1 compensation target, that can reduce your net emissions per seat, and that translates into a reduction in Scope 3 emissions for your customers.
And there's another group we haven't mentioned. In the other direction, you talked about the sort of the downstream emissions of customers. There's the upstream obligations of your fuel suppliers that maybe we should be talking about as well. I mean, after all, recently at least, over the past few years, the people making most money out of aviation have been not the people flying the planes, I mean the people supplying the fuel. And maybe, I think we should start the conversation about whether fuel suppliers have an obligation to do something about the CO2 that will inevitably be generated by the products they're selling the airlines. And I hope that's a conversation you're having with your fuel suppliers.
I completely agree, and I think especially where many of the oil companies have the opportunity for kind of point source capture of the emissions from the actual oil refineries. They already have the technology to do this. Oxy is a good example of this, where you've kind of applied that knowledge that you've got into now promoting carbon dioxide removals. So I think we need to see more of that from the oil companies. So I'm keen to hear from you, Anna, about your perspective on that and how we can do that more.
Well, what I can say is that I'm incredibly grateful to have been become part of an energy company that is committed to net zero at 2050 and that is investing significantly today. I think it's no small feat that our CEO on basically every earnings call talks about the carbon management business and the investment in direct air capture, and that they're literally bringing to bear over 50 years of experience of safely and securely putting CO2 deep underground and leveraging that experience into a new business line that allows them to both diversify but also contribute to solving the climate challenge.
But if I may, I mean, it's perhaps not very fair because they're not here, but maybe that's to be reflected on, that some of your competitors are very happy to talk about what they're doing about SAF or whatever, but the fossil stuff is, we're not going to talk about that. We're just going to carry on selling it as long as there's a market, as long as airlines want to buy it. And that, I think, that should no longer be acceptable. If you're selling the stuff, you're benefiting, you're profiting from the fact that somebody's using it, so you've got an obligation to participate in fixing the problem. Because coming back to this, to Hemant and Gabrielle's point about how it's not just about fixing our climate guilt, it's also about, I actually think that's not I think the whole guilt framing isn't a terribly helpful one at all. It's about enabling future generations and the majority of the world's population that's never taken a flight, to take a flight without making a choice between taking that flight and cooking the planet. We've got an obligation, and the people supplying fuels to airlines have an obligation to make that possible for the future.
And many of the people supplying the fuels are the ones with the best skills to safely and securely put that CO2 back.
Absolutely, as you are demonstrating.
I think, in essence, this comes down to carbon pricing. And really, if we look at kind of global solution for this, every tonne of carbon emitted should be priced. There should be no free emissions. And that's what the aviation industry really has been campaigning for since 2008, since we first started talking about trying to develop this global, we were an industry that asked for regulation on carbon pricing. Corsia is the current iteration of that. It goes part way. We need it to go further, but it's a great start and that can be used. We'd love to see that applied economy-wide to all sectors, and as you say, Myles, especially to the oil companies who are kind of drilling this and pulling this out of the ground. Really, every product, every service should have a carbon price attached, and that drives the behaviour then overnight. So that feels to me like the kind of the ultimate goal where we want to get to.
Well, and you picked up on aviation's leadership in this. The aviation sector has really coalesced around a vision for net zero in 2050, a vision for all of the levers that you need to pull. What can other sectors learn from what aviation has already done in terms of recognizing the role of removals, the role of efficiency in low carbon fuels, but particularly that piece on removals? What can the rest of the world learn from that?
I'll have a crack at that. I think it's super interesting to see how aviation's addressing this because it's at the cutting edge, because it's right there. But every single sector in the world depends on fossil fuels and fossil emissions in some form. And I speak a lot to lots of different sectors, and every single one thinks that they're uniquely hard done by. Every single one thinks that nobody else recognizes their efforts in this. And I let them say it all, and I say, you know what, I heard that last week from the other guys, or I heard that 2 months ago from someone else. So, but I do think one of the things I would say, it's not quite what other industries can learn, but we haven't talked very much today, slightly to my surprise, about the relationship between SAF and carbon removals. And what I do notice in the aviation sector is that removals are now being taken seriously, but it's just the very beginning. And there are maybe some other sectors that are taking removals more seriously and have been doing it for longer. And it's interesting to me that between things like operational efficiency, engines, hydrogen, electric vehicles, whatever, SAF is the big one that everyone focuses on, and I completely get that. It's a drop-in solution. It's really brilliant in lots of ways, but it's not going to be the whole answer. I think that the IATA roadmap was terrific, but I think that it's also a bit heroic in its assumptions. It's looking to me much more like at least 50-50 SAF and removals for what's going to have to be done here. And so it's now how removals and SAF can fit together is something that I think this industry really needs to think about. And in terms of what anyone else can learn, is that what I got from you, Hemant, and the IATA road mapping, which is we need to build this because it's existential for our future. And I don't hear any other sector talking like that. Other sectors might say, oh, we need a plan for our residual emissions, or at some point, or let's experiment with this. But we need to build this because it's existential for our future. It's actually existential for the future of every single sector. And it's existential for the future of all of us doing business on this planet. And so I think that's the one thing that other industries should really hear. We need to build this because it's existential for our future.
I love that. Hemant.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, and also just building on that also, one of the reasons why we were so focused on SAF, of course, drop-in solution, it's also recognized as an in-sector solution, which is really important for us in terms of the credibility for the net zero solution itself. And I think part of the problem we need to address in terms of removals is this stigmatism that's applied to offsets and out-of-sector solutions. So, we need to work to understand how best we can use the different technologies in the in-sector solutions as well, during the development of fuels, low carbon aviation fuels, or even for SAF as well, how that can be part and parcel of the solution. And then we need to see how best we can, as I explained earlier, educate everybody else to explain how carbon removals actually supports high integrity credits for removals of CO2, and how this is part of a different or more promising solution going forward, basically.
And if I could just chip in on this, I mean, there's this point about the case for removals going beyond simply being, in some people's framings, it might just sort of potentially cheaper or an alternative to SAF. I wouldn't see it that way at all, because if you're, as I said at the outset, if you're benefiting from the use of fossil fuels, we need to drive up global supply of removals. And one of the oddest objections I get is, oh no, the aviation industry shouldn't use removals because we need to keep it for something else to compensate for. Well, if we'd applied that logic to Pennsylvania oil, we'd have got rid of the whales even faster. Because if we have said, oh no, we've discovered oil in Pennsylvania, but let's keep it for future generations, and we'll just keep using whale oil instead, I mean, that would have been a bad outcome. We drive supply by using things. That is typically the way humans work. If there was a big demand now for engineered removals, we would have more engineered removals available in the future, not less. So I think one of the fundamental fallacies that many people have in their heads is there's some kind of finite bubble of CO2 storage available, and if we put some in there, then it automatically displaces some CO2 storage from somebody else. That's not the way it works at all. That's the sort of peak oil fallacy, that you think there's only a certain resource there, and therefore anybody who uses any of it is at somebody else's expense. No, we've got to build that industry, build that capacity, and the only way to do it is to get investment into it now.
Absolutely. I think I heard an anecdote that you can store something like 500 years of the entire United States emissions in the Permian Basin alone. You know, there's huge amounts of geologic storage. There's more than we need.
Yeah, but I mean, I think it's important not just to rely on the anecdotes, but to look back at history of our, you know, when we've had resource-constrained challenges, we've dealt with them by doing, not by, you know, academics like me modeling and saying, oh, this is what you're allowed to do.
I'm just going to build on Gabrielle's point there, bringing in kind of ESAFs, and you're absolutely right, of course, Gabrielle. I thought it might just be useful to put some colour on that, kind of how that kind of also fits into our strategy in IAG and BA. So you showed in your slides, Anna, the carbon engineering SAF. What do you call it? Air fuels?
Air to fuels.
Air to fuel. So yeah, that really, for aviation, is the holy grail. That's where we want to get to, because once all of our SAF is kind of power to liquid SAF, it's a closed loop system. There's no net contribution to the atmosphere. So with IAG, with BA, we're super excited that our partnership with 12, who's a supplier, small startup out of California, supplier of power to liquid fuel. So it's the biggest deal in Europe of this type of SAF, and it will be starting to operate across our group from as soon as next year. So again, it's showing that the technology solutions are here. To Myles's point, it's about scaling them as fast as possible. We really need to show the demands there, to stimulate the supply, and then let's get cracking with this, because it's super exciting, but it's also super essential.
Absolutely. I'd hoped we'd have time for audience discussion, but we've just had so much fun talking. So what we do have time for is for each of you to leave the audience. If you have one thing to leave the audience with out of today's discussion, what would that one thing be? And we'll, since we started over here earlier, we'll start over with Hemant and work it back to here.
Okay, so I think just building on the conversation, I think, of course, we talked about scale up. If we're going to really move on scale up, we need government support, we need incentives. We also need big players to come into the market, and the big energy providers and so on who have capabilities, like they do on SAF as well, by the way. It's time for the big corporations to really come up with.
Okay, so mine would be what I've said and what I've heard repeatedly on this panel is this is about building a new industry from scratch, an industry that's existential for all of us, but also not just the governments. I'm kind of allergic to saying government should do something. It's, well, what are we going to do to help that happen? And it's like buy now. Buy now. That argument for why I should buy now has just been transformed in the last 6 to 12 months. Get with the program, understand that you're going to need the supply, understand that you're going to need the prices set, and just get going now.
For me, echo, buy now, start now, let's do this now, as well as economy-wide carbon pricing. Honestly, that's where we need to go.
And just helping everybody recognize that if we're going to stop global warming in around the mid-century, which is what we need to do if we're actually going to meet our climate goals, we need everybody to recognize that from 2050, you can't sell stuff that causes global warming. Not a single government has actually come out, and I'm not sure even any corporates have come out and just acknowledged that very simple fact. Whether it's an airline ticket or the fuel to fill a plane, if it causes global warming, you're no longer going to have a license to sell it after 2050. And so companies need a plan. Everybody involved in anything that causes global warming today needs to have a plan to make sure they've either no longer using that product that's causing global warming, or they've fixed it. And in the case of fossil fuels, it's got to be fixed, because one thing's for sure, we are going to be still using fossil fuels well past 2050, and so we've got to work out how to fix them.
Wonderful. So we need to start now. Removals are existential. The faster we invest, the faster we'll be able to build supply. And we need portfolios now that transition to permanent carbon removals by mid-century. and we're seeing tremendous leadership from the aviation sector to get us moving. A huge heartfelt thanks to our absolutely fabulous panelists for coming up and really bringing this topic to life. Thank you to our audience for sitting here and listening to us over being outside looking at the air show. Really appreciate everyone coming here today. And please do reach out if you've got any questions or if we've sparked some future conversations for you. Thank you.